Welcome, everyone. Lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us here today at the Permaculture Film Club. We have a really wonderful film to share with you today. But before I introduce the film and our guest, I'd like to let you know that this is a monthly event. So every month we have a permaculture related film, something that is around the field of permaculture. It could be economics, it could be farming, it could be health, a whole lot of different topics. And I'm always really open to you nominating a film that you think would be good to follow up and see. So let us know if you have any great film suggestions, but we'll keep them coming every month. So typically it is, the third Monday of every month we host a film club. So you'll know to look out for the notices. And if you're on our newsletter list, you'll get the notices for that as well. So I would like to acknowledge that I'm seated here on the unceded lands of the Gubbi Gubbi and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And if you know where you're seated, I would love to encourage you to share. I know you're calling in from all around the world, but if you know the Indigenous custodians of the land in which you're seated, please type in. Also, let us know where it is that you're from. Drop in your name and in the chat and where you're calling in from. That'd be great. And if you're not already muted, if you just wouldn't mind doing that, sometimes we get a bit of feedback. So I'm just going to give a little bit of an introduction to what this film is and who's joining us, and then we'll just jump straight into the film. So today is actually the United Nations International Day of Happiness, which is something that's been going since 2013. The idea of the UN's International Day of Happiness is to really focus on finding ways that we can create more inclusive societies, ways to end poverty, ways to reduce inequalities, and ways to protect and increase well-being. Essentially looking at ways too that we can be doing earth care, people care, and fair share. So permaculture fits beautifully in with this. And Helena Norberg-Hodge, whose film it is that we're sharing today, has also done a film which we've screened before called The Economies of Happiness. And I'll share the link of that with you later, because if you've not already seen it, I highly recommend you go and have a look at that. So our film today is called Planet Local, A Quiet Revolution, and it's produced by Local Futures, which is the organisation that Helena Norberg-Hodge founded. I've been working with Helena since, 1992, when I volunteered with her first in Ladakh, and we've stayed in touch ever since. And her work has been incredibly inspiring to me all of that time, and it's really wonderful to intersect the permaculture work with the relocalisation work and really looking at her big picture activism. So thinking about what's going on in the world and then how can we bring that to our community scale to find ways to address this. And really that's what this Planet Local is all about. So there's a number of really powerful voices that will be included in this film. So it's 50 minutes. And it's essentially giving voice to a growing number of people who are looking to build a more beautiful world. And so there's grassroots activists from every continent alongside internationally renowned figures such as Noam Chomsky, Vandana Shiva, Russell Brand, Naomi Klein, Jane Goodall, Gabor Mate, and also Helena speaking there as well. So I really hope that you enjoy this. And it's 50 minutes, as I said. Please stick around till the end of the film and think about what questions you might like to ask the maker of this film, because we do have Helena Norberg-Hodge joining us at the end to be present and to share a little bit more depth of what's going on with their work at the moment at Local Futures, how you can get involved, and to answer questions. So if you've got a question, make sure that you either drop it in the chat. We have Maya here. I don't know if anyone can see. Maya's going to be looking out for questions and make sure that we can get them to Helena. And so just a little bit on Helena. Helena is a leading voice in the localisation movement, has been for several decades. She's the author of the book Ancient Futures, which has been translated and sold millions of copies around the world, describing the Ladakh experience. That's also a film, Ancient Futures. She's worked around the world as a leader of localization. You could kind of call her, I don't know, a revolutionary pioneer of the very peaceful kind. She's received a Right Livelihood Award, which is an alternative Nobel Peace Prize, and she's also been awarded the Goy Peace Prize. So please stick around for our conversation and Q&A at the end. So what I will do now is just take a moment to share my screen and get the film rolling. Welcome, everyone. It's lovely to have your company. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the film. I wonder whether you would like to just perhaps drop in some thoughts and reflections just now, or questions based on the film that we've just watched together. Helena is going to be joining us very soon, but I wonder whether anyone wanted to jump in. Well, actually, here she is right now. I was going to ask if someone wanted to jump in, but here she is. Welcome, Helena.
Hello.
Hi, Helena. Welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you.
It's just finished, so it was perfect timing for you to arrive just now. Thank you.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good.
So there's a few questions coming through in our chat room here, but I thought perhaps, maybe we could begin with just a couple of questions, because what you present in this remarkable film is some really challenging, complex, sticky problems that, as you beautifully described, it's hard to see the contours of. And so here we are, most of us involved in this conversation today are coming from, a permaculture localization background. And I wonder, how do we even begin to start to tackle that? What is the kind of education that we need to be sharing out with all of these groups in order for us to really be addressing it and not just kind of fiddling around on the edges? I think maybe you understand what I'm trying to ask you.
I do. And I mean, what I've found is that the people who have a better perspective on this big, essentially economic system that has been techno-economic from the beginning, and it was, was started by traders and globally active players who were already at that time quite powerful, and started by force. So this system, I think, in many ways is better seen and understood by people who've lived for a long time in the third world, so-called, outside of this Western system. But ideally, I mean, actually, generally, they will not necessarily look at it critically enough unless they've also lived in the West. And then they will see that actually the sort of propaganda, in a way, for joining an urban consumer rat race, the propaganda for that has been very, very strong from the outset. So when people were enclosed, pushed off the land into a Dickensian London, well, right at that time they were told it was good for them, I don't know, but certainly as things were made to look like improvements, because of course it was a mess when people were just pushed off the land and there was just no social cohesion, gap between rich and poor enormous, and of course a lot of health issues suddenly crowded on top of each other, ill health, pollution, crime. So it's a mess. So then later on, with more modernity, people were given their own little house in their own little, and constantly told how lucky they were that they were no longer on the land. So there's been this propaganda against farming and rural society from the outset. And in the West, I think it has been going on for so long, and we don't even realize that in the last 40 years, more than that, we have actually had to work harder to put food on the table and put a roof over our head. But we're not told that. We're told the economy is growing. We're told we're so lucky. And we then are made to feel guilty because we're told we've got everything. And those poor people over there don't have anything. And generally in the third world, things are not great these days. But the truth that this urban consumer culture doesn't make us happy, that it leads to friction, divisiveness, and intense competition is something that we need to understand better. And I think it can help to remove a lot of self-blame that's going on in the West, where the typical sort of middle-class person is made to feel responsible for this system, told that we are so greedy, we don't want to stop consuming it, we don't care about climate change, and all of this mess is our fault. And then look at those poor people on the other side of the world. This is simply a wrong message. Tragically, we've allowed our corporations, with the help of government, to become more and more powerful and to basically run the show, to continue foisting consumerism on our children, whether here in Australia or in Zimbabwe or in Bhutan. And we need to look at that system. So what's the best way? I think people can help share our material, and we're connected to other networks. And most of our colleagues are people who've had a foot in both the industrialized world and in the more land-based traditional. And usually, I know you were influenced by your time in Ladakh and later on in India. So many people have been sort of made more aware of this through international experience. And this is what's tragic now, is that even back in the 80s, when I wanted the organic movement leaders in Sweden to come to Ladakh to share the information, not tell people what to do, but to explain why we had outlawed DDT and why people had worked very hard to bring in organic agriculture. People say, oh, no, but I don't know if I want to disturb another culture like that. And I would also be criticized as this Westerner who's over there meddling. They didn't realize that I was trying to present information and alternatives to a very toxic fossil fuel-based system that was being introduced. And it wasn't in any way imposing anything, but it's just explaining, actually, these things have been banned and there are problems with them. Anyway, very long.
Yeah, I mean, I remember over there, there was massive diesel generators spewing out this toxic fumes in the middle of the city. And what you were introducing was, well, did you know that there's actually solar cookers, or there's, these other alternatives? And it's really not telling people what to do, but just opening up the possibilities of information. And that to me was a really powerful awakening of what are the possibilities for change. It's not telling, but exploring together what that is. And I guess that brings me to the second question, and it came up in the film about we need to build a broad-based movement. And I know that's what you're really about. I mean, you are connecting globally, and that your film was connecting with people from all around the world who are all themselves connected with incredible networks. How do you feel that that's going, and how can people get more involved in this? Because it feels to me like unless we're doing that, we're still staying in our little cells and membranes of good work, but it's this broad-based movement of communication, connection that seems to be really critical at this time, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, one of the things that I'm hoping our efforts will lead to is that people will be more interested in actively looking for the bigger picture, and ideally coming together in local groups to share the journey, because it can feel a bit overwhelming at first, because like you were saying, how do we deal with this huge system? And really the big issue is to be willing to look at it. Just be willing to look at it. Listen to the voices that have actually been studying it. And what happened to me was I was introduced by friends from Penang, actually, in Malaysia, to the fact that trade treaties were the main vehicle that were giving global banks and corporations more and more power. And it was such a relief at that time, because I had also ended up thinking, oh, this huge system coming into Ladakh, I'm seeing it in Sweden. And it was such a relief to realize there's a central trajectory, there's a central thread that we need to be aware of, that people had not been talking about, because there's huge propaganda for global trade. And it's all the time marketed as bringing us together, as peace, a global village, connection, when actually it's about increasing competition for scarce resources and making fewer and fewer people richer and richer, while more and more people get poorer and poorer. It's just mad. So I think actually, if people would be willing to just look at it, do it in a group, discuss it, take turns to maybe look at some of the articles, to look at the films, to read books, but, try to do it in a way that is enough of a community experience that you're thinking, what can we do? Not what am I going to do all by myself? Because then the we groups will often start a newsletter or maybe a podcast, or get on radio, do a newsletter. Really, even just spreading the word in the local area can lead to a much greater sense of empowerment also, because once you start putting on these lenses of global, local, you'll see that there is actually a huge willingness that so many more people than we are led to believe want answers, want to try to contribute. We're told that, as I say, we're just all greedy. And as people struggle more, for sure, there are people who can't afford to spend time looking at the bigger picture. And by the way, we should not be ashamed of being middle class and doing it. We should not try to say, oh, well, it's just middle class people. We should be saying middle class people have a responsibility to do this, and we want to encourage more middle class people to do that, because don't ask the most marginalized people who are, single mothers, living in poverty to be doing this work, because that's all been twisted around so that people are sort of ashamed, if they're white and middle class, they're useless, they can't even speak. So there are many things that have to be
speak up. Yeah. And I just, before we go to the questions in the chat, I wonder whether you could just speak a bit more about the notion of where is the change? Well, so where is the power to change? Like, where do you see the key part of where the power lies in?
I would say with the middle classes in the West.
Okay.
And that we need, especially the middle classes in the Anglo world, from Australia to Canada, US, UK, they're a little more embedded in a dominant narrative that is not as aware as in some other countries. Not that the awareness is that much greater necessarily, but people from the non-Anglo world are a little bit more aware of the imposition of a monoculture and are more aware of the link between genuine cultural diversity and localization, the need to respect adaptation to different ecosystems, and the fact that we had culture as a consequence of humans engaged with a particular place, climate, and ecosystem. And this is why we have the diversity of cultures, the diversity of races, even through that adaptation. And that adaptation is necessary if we want to maintain biological diversity. So that deeper link between cultural diversity and biodiversity needs to be better understood. And, the complex issue now of how do we maintain cultural self-respect in this globalized world. Well, actually, we're finding when there's a dialogue between Westerners and non-Westerners, everybody's very happy to maintain respect for their own culture. Doesn't mean at all retreating into exactly the way things were in the past. There are many things that can be, improved in most cultures, but we don't understand that the dominant consumer culture is an enormous leap in the opposite direction. And we couldn't be more destructive.
And I think what you mentioned before about this idea about just opening up the conversations, doing the research, collecting things to share with each other and work out what we can do together. And that's where your resources are so helpful. Like taking this film, for example, Planet Local, and screening it in with a local group. Doesn't have to be a big group, just a group that you can get together, start sharing local food and imagining what you can do together. And it's kind of, it becomes infectious in a way. It's this contagious positivity that's like, oh, what's going on over there? And it kind of just seeps into the community around. And I think just start where you are with what you've got, with the people that are around you, and really, find a way to deeply connect to place. And I think the power comes from that. And often we think that we can't change so dramatically, we can't change the system, but it's amazing, actually. It's Jeremy Lent described it really beautifully. He was sort of saying that there's this weave, and as you gradually weave these other threads through it, they sort of dissipate and you're left with a new weave. And I really like that. It's not like we're pushing also one away and replacing another.
Exactly. And so it's not, the shift that we're talking about does not have to require any major sacrifice that is sudden and extreme, even for the big corporations. What would happen if we do get a citizen movement to demand that governments actually represent the values that more and more of us, of course, represent? Number one, that we need to have secure livelihoods, but also that we can't do that while destroying the real economy, the living earth. So that demand from people translating into action would mean that these global corporations would start getting regulated and they would no longer be subsidized. Mm-hmm. We now have, and as they get regulated, the goal would be that they have to choose. Are they going to be Australian or American or Swedish? So they'd have to adhere to the rules determined through democratic process. What's happening now, tragically, is that the US is just bringing in this Inflation Reduction Act, which sounds great, is all about renewables and so on, but is actually a huge packet of subsidies for big business to rape other countries for more rare minerals, to continue in the same direction, but worse, because it's now about feeding robots and their needs, huge energy requirements and scarce rare earth minerals. So there's a really important need for a wake up, because it all now can sound very good and it really isn't.
And I think this is too where I've put a link into the chat about connecting with your newsletter, because finding out the kind of things that you uncover and explore and put out into the world are things that you don't see in standard media. You don't get that perspective on things. And I think it's so important that people are in touch with what you're doing and be able to then share those perspectives out to amplify the voice of what's coming out. If follow Local Futures on Instagram, and share them onto your stories. Just find ways to keep amplifying this message out, I think, is a really important thing to do. Yeah.
And there's also, remember that we're talking about economic localization as a process. It's not about drawing a circle around any community and saying, now you're just going to be imprisoned in this place and you're not going to have any relationships with other people. So there are a lot of people on the left who are very nervous of localization, because they believe that in impoverished communities, it would be very, very not only difficult, but they see, for instance, impoverished communities in America, where you often have a black and white community, different communities that are where the white people are extremely prejudiced and so on. And then they imagine that we're saying, well, now you're just going to have this like wall around you, and you're not going to be able to essentially do what we're talking about, which is weave interdependence in order to create an economy that works for both of you. That's basically what localization is about. So it would be a win-win in almost any community, but it's complex, and people, they do need to think about it a bit too. To really understand what we're on about. There's
no cookie cutter response either, is there?
No.
It's all
everywhere different. That's the wonderful thing. deep respect for genuine diversity.
Mm. I'm going to ask Maya now whether you could drop in speak out some questions, perhaps, Maya. And if anyone would like to speak up and ask a question directly, use the little link down below, the hand, to put up your hand, and then it'll pop you to the front of the queue and we can see you. But Maya, go ahead and ask some questions. Thanks.
Yeah, so there's some great questions in the chat, but I think a good one to lead on from that would be Catherine asked, she said that the comment in the film, decolonizing our imagination, really hit her. And she's asking, how can we best navigate decolonization and embrace localization in ways that are truly inclusive and respectful of cultural diversity, and particularly where First Nations community members have been most significantly impacted by colonization? And also, maybe if there's a potential for co-design pathways that also work towards reconciliation.
Well, definitely. I mean, that is beginning to happen, because basically localization is about re-indigenization. So it's already beginning to happen that communities are reaching out to their indigenous cultures in different countries. What I would, however, also say is that very often really traditional indigenous people are not aware enough about the workings of the dominant Western system. So paradoxically, often the indigenous people who are the most remote, for instance, I've seen the nomads on the Tibetan plateau and also in Mongolia and so on, and they are often the most vulnerable. And that's, again, where actually white middle-class people who have understood that this system isn't working for them and it's not working for anyone shouldn't hesitate to reach out and to realize that their voice is very valuable in essentially articulating the problems with this dominant consumer culture. But in order to become, really helpful advocates in all that, we also have to be a bit more informed and strengthened by that bigger picture I'm talking about. I hope.
And also practice to articulate it as well. And that's where I think those conversation groups are great, because you can start to gather it and practice how to express it together. Sometimes it can be, if it's the first time you've come across it, it can be really quite challenging to piece together those ideas, because it's like it's bumping up against your paradigm.
Yeah, wonderful that you who've done it so well are training Maya now. It's wonderful. And it is also, I must say, this movement is led by women. It's led by women, and they have a deeper, again, of course, many exceptions, but very clearly, even in Tibet, even in Bhutan, it's the women who are more anchored in the deeper ecological and social interdependent networks, and who feel a stronger and deeper reaction to what is a patriarchal consumer culture. However, right now, I am organizing this big meeting in England that I hope people will look at, and there will be streaming. Some of you might want to come. It's going to be very, very special. We have about 80 speakers, and we have people already saying they're going to come from Chile and pay their own way just to listen, because more and more people are really excited about this perspective and hearing it from global voices. And so my struggle in all of that has been that it's been really difficult to find enough women. And it's been, it's really, really, really difficult, because mostly women are not the visible advocates. They're the ones who are actually doing the work. And and it makes me really also realize how I wish you could be there more, but I just can't afford to bring you, because we're bringing people from the other side of the world at huge expense already, and usually, more people from the non-Western world.
Great. I wonder whether I can find a way to wangle my way there anyway.
Well, if you can, I would definitely love you on stage.
Yeah, great.
Some people are actually doing that, raising money to come.
Yeah, great. And Maya, I want to go back over to you. and see whether you have another question that you'd like to bring into the conversation.
Yeah, so there's kind of a combination of two questions by Thomas and Daniela, which is kind of based around how do you convince kind of the people around you? So Daniela was saying, how do I convince my partner to buy the more expensive local eggs and not the cheap ones from Aldi? As long as the supermarket food that has been shipped around the world is still as much cheaper than locally produced, it's just more affordable. And Thomas was saying that I don't think many people who act in a consumerism way wouldn't admit or agree that they were consumers. Many people just think that it's normal what they're doing. And so his mother agreed that we should provide more of our own food, but within the next sentence, she's already talking about planning her next flight on holiday or which TV show she's enjoying, and then doing a shop from a major supermarket. He loves seeing the grassroots campaigns, but how do you get the masses to shift?
Well, I think this idea, how do we get the masses to shift, is one of the most counterproductive ideas, because as you will have heard often from people like, from many people, you will have heard that a relatively small group of people can actually shift the bigger picture and have enormous influence, and whether it was human rights or women's rights or the ending of slavery and so on. There have been many examples of that. And it wasn't the masses who actually changed and led the way. It was relatively small numbers. So don't think about how can we change the masses, because we always then have this picture of this completely unconscious person sitting in front of television. But you see, also what we're saying is very different from the mainstream environmental movement. We would prefer that we don't talk about how we all need to pay more for our food. We would prefer that we let people know that if we come together to create more localized alternatives, farmers can be paid far more and we can pay less for genuinely organic, genuinely healthy food. So there's a whole education process there too. But the other part of that is also that, for goodness sake, let's not allow our governments to subsidize old, toxic, processed food from far away and make that artificially cheaper. Let's not allow them to be subsidizing the whole, across the board, whether it's in agriculture, whatever, housing, subsidize essentially global monopolies, ultimately, to the detriment of local businesses everywhere. So we're really coming with a different message. We're coming with a message that says, you are actually working harder than you would need to in an economy that was actually truly efficient, an economy where your government was actually looking after its citizens, and where you were educated enough to understand that the way growth is measured, you are supporting both on left and right leaders that measure progress in a way that means with more breakdown, more illness, more pollution, the economy grows. It's insane. But the extent of that insanity is unfortunately very poorly understood. So it's mainly about that understanding. And I actually am convinced that many people, even the members of those masses, would be shocked and not want to support a continuation in this direction. But there's some basic building blocks there. So I do recommend the Economics of Happiness film as well that we made, that I hope you might show. And
we have screened it before, but I think it's probably time to screen it again.
I think so too. I think it is relevant. I'd love to make an updated version of it, which we might.
It's still really relevant. And there's two things that I wanted to pick up on what you just said then. And one was about this notion of efficiency, because what you described then is, the efficiencies of nature. And we've been brainwashed in a way to think that the kind of global manufacturing system is more efficient, whereas it's just inherently full of waste and externalized waste that are not counted in any of the equations. And so I think that's kind of something really interesting to unpick, because people always say, well, at the end of the day, at the bottom line, it's all of those sort of blahs that come out of our mouths.
Yeah, and that have been fed to us. That's the thing. We have seen not evil people, I'm sure, but think tanks funded by big business, and in academia as well, sadly, it's gone in this direction of, as we know, in biology, we have the labs now for genetic engineering. We don't have, academia has been shifting in a very for-profit direction, in a fatal way. And so many good people working in a more specialized field have not been aware of it. And so for me, the biggest problem is blindness. It's not evil intent or conscious manipulation, but it's a de facto conspiracy we're facing, where larger and larger scale economic units linked to having amassed more and more wealth and power, linked to essentially the funding of knowledge, whether in academia, whether in the media, in science, across the board. The money has had far too much influence. And we used to see in Scandinavia that there we used to have a bit more research for the public good. And we used to have, it was out of Scandinavia that studies would show that, for instance, pesticide reduced the sperm count in men or whatever. But even in Scandinavia now, they've gone down this corporate line blindly. It's not through conscious choices. I think just blindly adhering to the basic building blocks of how growth is calculated, how the subsidies, regulations, the infrastructure that's built up has been more and more for global players. And that means
right. I mean,
look at the role of the internet. We have to look at the role of the internet and the financial casino. We have to look at when once you start seeing it, it becomes so clear how those subsidies for the global infrastructure, the deregulation of global players, has led to the constant destruction of the small and the local. The post office have to amalgamate, hospitals have to amalgamate, whole towns die and they have to merge, all the time moving into more, bigger and bigger urban centers.
Yeah. This independent public thinkers, I think is so important. I mean, you are an independent institute, really generating knowledge. That's what I do here as well. And it's really interesting to hear, Maya's just entered into university, and she's at one of the leading universities in Australia, and one of the main research universities in Australia. And she just told me the other day what percent, Maya, is publicly funded and what percent is corporately funded?
It only gets 40% from the government. And so
40%. And it's one of the, didn't you say it's one of the highest publicly
that's the
funded?
highest government funded university in Australia.
And that just it tells you exactly what's going on.
Yeah. And if you were to look back, you would see at a certain point, that it would be primarily government funding or exclusively. And then you'll see gradually over these years, as this support for the global corporations has grown, you'll see that basically governments getting poorer and going with their begging bowls to big business, saying, can we have a PPP, public-private partnership? And we don't realize how disastrous that is. And again, primarily, well, not primarily, but also for what is honest research, what is really research in the public interest. Excuse me.
I wonder if there's any other questions that are lurking in the as one last question.
Okay. All right, so someone asked, in my community on the shore of the English Channel, La Manche, we are seeing a huge rise in far-right activism, particularly based on racism and xenophobia. How do we balance encouraging localization with the natural migration of humans?
And so I didn't hear the very beginning of that. Were you talking about England, or were you talking about?
On the edge of the English Channel, in the French side, yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've been trying to write about the rise in prejudice and fear and racism for a long, long time, because I've seen so clearly that the insecurity created by the system, which, as I was saying before, by helping the big and global and destroying the smaller, the local, even medium-sized businesses that are place-based, subject to heavy taxation and ever heavier regulation. These are keys to look at, that every place-based business is regulated and heavily taxed. In the meanwhile, the global players that we know pay virtually no tax and are actually subsidized. And that's through a whole range of rebates, all kinds of hidden ways, but also deregulated, no rules. So in this situation, jobs are being destroyed, communities are being torn apart, people are more and more competitive, and with that competition and fear grows prejudice of the other. And I have seen that in Bhutan, I've seen it in Ladakh, I've seen it in Sweden, I've seen it in Ireland. I've seen it very clearly, not really about racism as much as it is about the insider and the outsiders coming in. So even in England, quite a long time ago now, this has died down for now, but it's an example I like to give. When a lot of people from London were coming to Wales, which was a relatively poor part of England, buying up the farmhouses as their country houses, there was this hatred, there was a burning of houses. I saw similar things in Ireland when Americans were coming over and buying up whole villages and houses, again, even burning down houses, and just this hatred and deep prejudice. And that wasn't racial. It was about insider, outsider. Actually, we had a very similar pattern for a while with Germans coming into Sweden. So this, of course, when there's also a racial divide, it's even clearer and stronger. So I'm not saying at all that racism isn't an issue, but I don't see racism as the core problem. I see the core problem, the creation of insecurity, the artificial creation of unemployment. There's no justification for any unemployment whatsoever on this planet. There's so much that needs doing. It's just tragic that we've just not been educated to look at the economy.
Mm. Thank you so much, Helena, for coming and sharing with us after the wonderful Planet Local film. I'm going to be sending out to everyone a link to how they can share the film out with their own community. And I know that you have many different translations available too. So if you want to share it somewhere not in English, that's also possible. And also sharing out any links to your work. Is there anything that you particularly wanted to mention, maybe about World Localisation Day coming up or any other events?
Well, yes, World Localisation Day we launched 3 years ago to try to celebrate the worldwide localization movement. And what I can tell you is that for us, it's so inspiring, because as we try to identify and as we work with examples of where people have actually consciously started rebuilding their community interdependence, the local face-to-face relationships, and particularly connected over land, particularly connected over food. There are just so many inspiring examples. So we get almost everyday examples. We can't keep track of all of them, but we're trying to celebrate this, and we're linking up with, with people in, 50 countries, and on the World Localization Day, which we chose June 21st, because in the Northern Hemisphere, it's the summer equinox and people are out on the land celebrating. And so, yeah, if any of you want to join that, sometimes people just organize a local food feast. Recently, I spoke in Melbourne at the Sustainable Living Festival, and I was very pleased. They had organized what they call the Great Local Picnic, and we had Costa there. And so people are definitely waking up to the need to turn towards that face-to-face connection with others and with nature. It's all about reconnection, and it's so healing. More and more evidence about how it reduces depression, and has been, such a clear clear need. We all long for that connection. It's how we evolved, as I try to say in the film.
Yeah. And I think, you
Well,
know,
thank you so much, Morag, for doing this. And thanks to all of you who listened. I hope you'll think
Yeah.
about it. I don't expect you all to be persuaded.
But I think sharing the good stories as well and linking them with the big picture. You know, I saw a whole lot of chatter going on when there were some really great examples and something that people can tangibly understand, but then always loop it back out to that bigger picture so that, you know, local global awareness is building. Yeah. Thank you everyone for being here. It's been an absolute delight. I wanted to also thank anyone who donated to be part of this. We're going to be sending today $524 to support refugee local food projects in Eastern, in Uganda primarily. So thank you, Helena, for helping to contribute to that. That's wonderful. And yeah, thank you so much for being here and chatting with us.
And thank you, Maya, too. Nice to see you.
Yeah, thank you, Maya. All right. Lots of love.